Um, I'm going to go through the process and like Stacy said, she is in the chat. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them as we go and I can repeat or answer your questions out loud. The first thing I'm going to go over is the storing grades diagram, and this is a diagram that Stacy created for us to use as an example. We very highly suggest that you make one of these based on your own grading buckets. So these are the grading buckets that we have set up in the Opelika pilot site. And with these, we have charts. So you'll see that we went over the end of the first quarter, what levels we had versus whether or not we store with or without credit, and they're color coded. So it would be a great idea for you to make one of these for your district or your school if you have not already. So the first thing we're going to look at is this setup for your school. So we're actually going to be at the school level. Storing grades does have to happen at the school level. It cannot be done district-wide, so each individual school will need to do that. So we'll look at your reporting term setup. So at your school, we're going to go to school setup, and then we're going to go to the grading heading. Oh, pull me back up. And then we are going to look at the final grade reporting term setup. And this is where you'll see your setup, your pyramid. And it's important to understand this so you know where you need to store grades and for what levels. So we have at the top here, and yours may look different because it will be based on your school and what your school needs. At the top, we have our year-long courses. These are courses that start in August and end in May. So within that, we have an F1, which would be our final grade. We have our Q1 through 4, which are 9-week grades. And then we have our X1 and our X2, which would be our semester exam grades. So our semester exam at the end of the first and the semester exam at the end. Yours may look a little different. Some schools award half credits, and so they may have an F2, F1 and an F2. You may only have one final exam, but however your setup, you need to understand that so you'll know what to store and when. In this example, the next level down are semester long courses. These are courses that start and finish all in one semester. So we have our F, which is our final, and then with semester 1, we have Q1 and Q2 because my semester 1 goes from August 9th to December 16th, and then it is ending, and that is my final grade for that F1. My semester 2 is January 1st, or January 4th, excuse me, to May 26th. And then I have my Q3 and Q4 because those are the 9 weeks that fall within that semester 2 range. Then my next level down are the quarter classes. So these are classes that start and end within a 9 weeks. So if you have a block schedule and your seniors are taking government and econ all in the fall semester on that block schedule, they finish government after 9 weeks and they go to the next econ class for the second 9 weeks. So we have the grading buckets associated with that. Each of these are independent, so I do not have to have an F1, an F2, an F3, an F4 within these quarter-long classes because they're independent of each other and they are attached to this grading period. And so we have this chart where we can see we've color coded. So in our example here, for my year-long courses, at this point in time that we're at right now, we're December 14th, so it's the end of first semester. I'm about to store my Q2 grades, which is my second 9 weeks for my year-long courses. I have an exam for my year-long courses at the end of the first semester. For my semester 1 courses, that's this fall semester only, they are finished at this point. So I'm going to be storing my Q2, my exam grade, and my final grade. And then I'm going to be looking at Q2 classes if I have those. They have started and finished within this period. So I'm storing the Q2, the exam, and the F1. So a question that is asked a good bit is, if I don't give exams, do I have to have a Q2 and an F1? No, you could just have that F1 if you wanted to, if you don't have an exam. So this right here, this setup is going to take my 9 weeks grade and my exam grade to give me a final grade. So it's important to understand where these buckets fall, what classes they're associated with, and when we need to store them. So our Q grades are our 9 weeks grades. Our X's are our exams, and our F's are the final grade. And again, you may have an F2 in here. Your setup may look a little bit different. So it's important to think about when this class ends, what am I storing, and is this grade final? So when we're looking down here at the end of second quarter, where we're at now, for my year-long courses for 22-23, my Q2 is just a second 9-week grade. It's just going to give me a point in time historical record of what the student's second 9-week grade was. So I want to store that so I have that record, but I don't want to award any credit. And the same thing if you have an X1 attached to your semester long course or your year long courses, excuse me. I want to store that. I want a record of it, but I don't want to give credit because neither one of those are final. The same thing with my semester 1. That is a 9 weeks grade, and an exam grade, it's not a final grade. So the Q2 is not the end. I need to store with credit for my F1. That is the final grade. And then for my quarter-long classes, if I have a class that started and ended all within this quarter, and I have the separate Q2, X1, and F1, I'll be storing all of those, and I'll be storing with credit for F1. So our final grades are our F grades, our F1s. We only want to store those when we're awarding credit and the grade is final. Okay? So right now, Q2, December, that is finished. That class is started. It's finishing maybe on Friday, maybe next week. So yes, the grade can be final. Semester 1, that's finishing. Yes, the grade can be final. The grade is not going to be final for a year-long course at this point. There is a way to view your courses and which fall into which category. So I'll show you guys that. If you have the PSCB custom reports on your homepage, if you'll go to that PSCB custom reports, and we have scheduling current year, and then we also have enrollment counts. And this allows you to see the term length for the courses, and you can filter or reorder them. So I can see which courses fall into which term length. So if I'm looking for just courses that are year long, and remember this is a pilot site, so I don't have a whole lot, but you would have way more. These are all of my courses that start in August and end in May. My S1s are all of my courses that start in August and end in December. And if I had any quarter-long classes, they would show here as well. So I could see which classes I'm storing when I store for that particular level. So if you wanted to identify those, that is a way to do it. So when I store for semester 1 courses here in just a minute, these are the courses that I'm going to be storing grades for. When I store a Q2 for my year-long courses, these are the courses I'm going to be storing for. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started with the process. So on your home screen, again, at the school level, so you have to be at the school, we're going to go down to System under Setup. And then we're going to scroll to Grades, and you'll see Permanently Store Grades. So this is where we're going to do the storing process. It remembers the last thing that we did, so we're going to need to update this. So I see a question. If final grade reporting terms set up are labeled as S1 and S2, can S1 be stored as F1 with credit? So that is one thing I was going to mention later. Keep in mind that Dragonfly, if your courses, if you're doing for, excuse me, if you are a high school, you're pulling for, goodness gracious, I cannot get this out. Athletic eligibility, Dragonfly is going to pull from those F grades. So you can trick the system. And when we choose the reporting term, we could say that we want that S1, but we could save it with a different historical code. So yes, and Stacy answered that much more succinctly in the chat. All right, so we are starting. Let's look back at our diagram here. We have our year-long courses, semester 1, quarter 2. We're going to start with our Q2 store code. So we're going to look at this. This says for Q2, all of my levels I'm storing without credit. So I'm going to go ahead and choose that Q2 grading reporting term. And then I want this to match in almost all cases, unless you're that special situation that we just talked about. So I want to do this as Q2 for the historical store code as well. The next thing down is the exclude or include class enrollments. And this is where we can get some mistakes. If you have a lot of schedule changes, if you have students that enroll in courses, the teacher puts a grade in the grade book, and then that student withdraws from that class and changes their schedule into another class. If we do not choose one of these options, then they are going to get a stored grade for those dropped classes. So we need to tell PowerSchool to only include enrollments as of a certain date or exclude enrollments as of a certain date. So kind of the best practice is to ensure that you're choosing one of these. I know in the previous session, Stacy recommended choosing this last one, which is include only enrollment records that are currently active and that were active on this date. So for that date, we want to back up the end of our grading period by 4 days. So this allows for all of those schedule changes that may have happened at the beginning of the year, at the beginning of the 9 weeks, to take into account. Let's pull all those kids out. We only want the ones that were active 4 days backed up from the end of our grading period. So if I look at my diagram, my grading period ends on 12/16 for semester 1 and for quarter 2. So I'm going to back up 4 days from that. So I'm going to say 12/12. And so I'm only going to include records where the student is active right now and they were active as of 12/12. So if they drop that class before and there's a teacher's grade in the grade book, it's going to pass over those. It's not going to store. The next thing down, the additional filter options, we really probably won't be using those at this point. So we can, keep that minimized. But when you do need to possibly come back later and restore a grade for a certain class, or at the end of the year when you need to store for seniors, you can do that here. The next section down are the classes by term length. So this is where we're telling PowerSchool for which courses are we going to store Are we going to not store? Or are we going to store with credit? So you have your drop down boxes here, and your options again are do not store, store with credit, and store with no credit. So that is where our diagram comes in handy again. So I'm at the end of second quarter. My semester long or my year long courses have a Q2. They're stored with no credit because again, that is not the final grade. For semester one, my Q2, I'm storing with no credit because that is not a final grade. And then same for quarter two, I'm storing with no credit. So this is telling me for my year-long classes, I want to store with no credit, semester long, store with no credit, quarter two, store with no credit. And then I don't have to worry about this percentage of credit because I'm not awarding any credit. So this is all for Q2. And then the next thing down is the classes enrolled at other schools. So if you have a remote enrollment process that you do for your Career Tech Center or for your alternative school, this allows you to store those grades for all the schools that your students are enrolled in. And then you choose, do you want the record school name to be this school or do you want it to be the other school? So if I have a Career Tech Center or an alternative school attached to Opelika High School, I can include all schools and it'll pull those grades in. And I could say I want the record for that grade to be Opelika High School, or I can say the other school because I want it to say Opelika Career Tech Center. And so for the rest of the options on the page, we can ignore those, but let's just review really quick. We're going to store for Q2. We want the same historical code. We want to make sure we choose one of these three options to include or exclude. So I have selected the third option to include only enrollment records currently active and that were active on 12/12 because that is 4 days backed up from the end of my grading period. For my year-long courses, I want to store Q2 with no credit. I just want a historical record of that 9-week grade. For my semester courses, I want the same thing, a historical record of the second 9-week grade, but I'm not awarding credit. And for my quarter courses, I'm doing the same thing, storing with no credit. It's not my final grade. And then I'm choosing schools, all schools. So I get the Career Tech Center or the alternative school or any other school that I'm attached to. And then I want the other school's name to show, or you could choose your school. And then we're going to click Submit. All right, and it will tell us that it's storing grades for Q2. It'll tell us, please wait, it could take several minutes. I don't have a whole lot of grades in, so mine doesn't take very long. I have 242 stored grades complete. So that was just Q2. And now we need to move on to our next step, which is X1. So I'm going to go back to my start page. And I'm going to go back to System. And I'm going to go back to Permanently Stored Grades. And it remembers what I was doing last time. But the next thing I'm going to need to store is my X1. So if you have final exams at this point, then this would be your next step. So just remember to look at your diagram. If you have X1s that are attached to your year-long courses and they're being given right now, you have an X1 now and an X1 later or an X2 later. Or if you have semester-long courses that have a final exam now, you have that X1 bucket. Or if you have those quarter-long classes that have that separate X1, that's where we would need to store these. So I'm going to choose X1. I want the historical code to be the same here as well. I'm going to do the same include exclude statement. So I'm going to choose this third option, and I'm going to back up my date 4 days. And this time, let's check the chart again. For all of my X1s, I'm also storing with no credit at the end of Q1. So I'm going to choose store with no credit, store with no credit. If you do not have an X1 at this time in your year-long classes, then you would not need to store at this point for X1 for year-long courses. So if you only give a final exam at the end of the year, then your X1 could stay do not store for 22-23 year-long courses. This would only be if you have an exam now and you have an exam at the end of the year. So we're store with no credit in my example. So all three, again, are store with no credit. Those exam grades are not final grades. And then I want to do store grades for classes enrolled at all school, and I want to store the name of the other school. I'm going to click submit again. It's telling me that I have stored X1, and for the courses that had X1, I have 240 grades. So now we're going to go back and do F1. So I'm going back to system. And under grading, I'm going to do permanently store grades again. And this is where I'm going to be storing my final grades. So if we look at that chart, if you have a school setup where you're awarding half credits in the fall for a year-long course and half credits in the spring for a year-long course, they're in the course all year, but they get 0.5 at the end of the fall and 0.5 at the end of the spring, then you may have an F1 and an F2 set up here. If that's the case, we'll talk about that as well. But for our ones that have semester 1, quarter 2, we're going to store with credit at this point because the course is finished. That grade is final. So I'm going to change my reporting term to F1. I'm going to change my historical code to F1. I'm going to do the same include or exclude statement. I'm going to back it up to December 12th. And this is where I have to determine whether or not I have an F1 right now for my year-long courses. If I do not, if you only have an F1 set up for your year-long courses and do not also have an F2, then your grades for your year-long courses are not final at this point. So you would want to make sure that you do not store F1 yet for those. My semester ones are going to store with credit because the semester is over. That F1 is the final grade. And I want to give 100% of the course credit. Same thing for my quarter 2 F1. So if I have quarter long classes that are finished at the end of quarter 2 and they have, excuse me, I clicked the wrong thing. They have that F1, that grade is final, they're moving on to another class, then I want to give 100% of the credit. So this is a little bit of a misconception. It doesn't matter if it's just a half credit course. If it's a semester long course and they're only getting a half credit, if it's completely finished, we want to give them 100% of the credit now that they've earned. It's going to take the potential and give it 100% of that potential that they've earned. Now, if you are that special situation where you are giving half credits, If you have an F1 and an F2 for your year-long courses, then at this point you would want to award half credit. And so you would store with credit and you would say 50% because you only want to give them half of what their potential credit for the full course is at this point. That is, again, only if you are doing half credits at the end of every semester for a year-long course. So this is not our half credit courses that are just a semester long. So in my example, I do not have those, so I'm going to choose do not store. So again, that is only if you have F1s. If we go back up here, if you have an F1 and an F2 up here, then that is when you can store F1 at this point and give half 50% of the credit. But for all of the other examples that like on mine here, for my F1, for my year-long course, my F1 isn't finished yet. That's my final grade at the end of the year in May. All right, so I'm storing with credit 100% for semester 1 and quarter 1, and then I have my options for schools. Other schools, I'm going to choose all schools, and that I want the name to be the other school, and then I'm going to submit. All right, so I have completed that storing grades process for all of those. Next, we're going to look at null grades and things like that. Stacy, did you want to add anything before we move on to that?
Yeah, if you will, Kendall, go back to that stored grades page. There's one thing that I want to touch on that happens sometimes because of the lag time we have in dates from December to January. Excuse me, y'all. Okay, the classes by term length. If you have your calendar set where your semester 1 ends, like you see how mine ends in this on 12/16, y'all, there's a date timer on this page. It's a 30-day window. If you try to store for grades that are 30 days past the end of that date there, it actually drops it off of this window. So I do know that there's some districts that wait until like mid-January to store their first semester grades, and you're going to come to this page and go, oh my gosh, where did semester 1 and quarter 2 go? They're going to disappear. When that happens, you can call them back up. Do you see there's a little sentence down below there? If you're storing for a term that's not in progress or has recently passed, you can say, do you want to show all terms? You'll need to flip that to yes. And when you do, it's basically going to show you the whole year. This can be a little overwhelming and confusing, so you've got to be careful with this to make sure you're storing in the correct button. And if you are 30 days past due and you're like, yes, PowerSchool, I do know I'm late doing this, but I'm going to go ahead and put it in. When you tell it the store Q1, it's going to pop up a screen and say, hey, are you sure you want to store for this older grade? And you'll have to say yes before it will actually allow you to proceed and do the store. So best practice, if you can keep your storing within that 30-day window of the end of your term, you won't run into this issue. So I just want to give you a heads up on that. If you are one of those districts that store a little later on in January, but have your quarters and terms ending in December.
All right, so let's go look at Mickey's historical grades so we can see what he has now that we've done the store process. So I'm going to go to Mickey and choose historical grades under the academics heading. And I can see now that he had a grade stored for Q2 for one of his courses that he was in. Doesn't look like we had any other grades in for him. But you'll notice that we have some dots and we have some dashes as well. So if I have a dot in my historical grade, that just means I haven't done anything with that yet. And so maybe they haven't been stored. It's not time to store yet for that one. But when I have a dash, that actually is a null grade. So if I click into that dash, you'll notice basically Mickey was enrolled in this class, but the teacher did not put any grades in the grade book. And so when I stored, it stored this blank grade here, but the percent is 0. And so when you're pulling your honor roll and your GPA, things like that, then you are going to be pulling this 0% if you have those null grades. And so once we store, there's a couple of things we need to check for, and these null grades are one of those things. So the first thing we need to do is prevent null grades, and we can do that by looking at the courses at the district level. So I'm going to go back over to district office. If you were on here earlier, you saw us looking at the courses earlier for a question, but I'm going to go to district setup, and under courses, when I click into a course, there is an option as it loads that I have where I can exclude from storing final grades. So if you have classes that students are in for rostering purposes, or let's say it's a homeroom that doesn't receive grades, or an advisory that doesn't receive grades, if you have students scheduled into a course and there's not going to be any grades placed in the grade book for that course, then you need to make sure that this box is checked at the district level for that course, because this will prevent null grades from being stored. So you'll need to identify all of those courses for your school, your district, that meet that requirement, that are those rostering courses, those if you're using special ed caseloads, if you have courses set up for your coaches, those homeroom courses, or basically those anything that's not going to get grades, you're going to want to make sure that this box is checked in the course setup at the district level, and that will prevent those null grades from being stored, and it will not hurt your honor roll report. But once we store, if that was not already done, we can search for those null grades, and we can use DDE to find those. And then if you have access, you can delete them with DDA. So we'll go through the process of how to find those. So we're actually at the school level. You could do this at district level as well if you wanted. So I'm going to go down to system, and I'm going to use direct database export, DDE. And I'm going to be working with the stored grades table. So these are the tables available, and stored grades basically is going to have all of the grades that we've stored. I'm just going to grab all of them first. So once we have all of the stored grades, we need to filter down and find just the null grades that we're wanting to work with. So every year in PowerSchool has an ID, so we need to filter to just this year's grades. So we would do that by searching for a term ID, which is greater than or equal to 3,200, which would be this year's ID. And then I'm going to search for those. So I'll pull all of the stored grades now for this year. So I have 9,000. And then I can filter even further, and I can say I want just the grades that are null. So I have my stored grades for just this year, and now I can say grade is null. And I've already filtered down. I want to make sure I'm only searching within my school, and I want to search within the filtered records I've already grabbed. So I'm going to search within these. And it should find all of my null grades. Thank you. There we go. So now I have 602 null grades. So that is probably from Q1 and Q2 that we've stored. I can look at the table view and I can see all of the different courses, the grade level, and I can see that all of these grades are blank. And so if you have access then to DDA, you could then change over to DDA and delete these null grades. So it does not affect your honor roll or anything like that. Because again, those courses that have null grades, that's going to tank your honor roll. Those kids are getting counted in for those null grades, and they're not going to show up on your honor roll report and things like that. The next thing that we could do is if you have transfer students that come in from another district that uses a different store code than what you use. So if they have an S1 and an S2 or something like that that you need to show as an F1, you could actually search for those using the very similar process. So we would search for records. I'm going to go back and select all of the records in the stored grade table. And I want to just use this year. So I'm going to do term ID greater than or equal to 3,200 again, only within my school. So I'm going to search those records. So I have those 9,000 grades. And then I can do a search for store codes that are not the store code that I use in my school. So I have store code, and I could say does not contain, and I can search for one of the store codes that I use. So I could say does not contain F, and I can find all of those store codes that are not what I use in my system that I could then use DDA to update to show them as F1s if that is what I'm needing to do. So that's pretty much it. Anything else to add, Stacy?
So a couple of things, because we know that when you store grades, things are going to happen. You're going to find anomalies like kids that grades don't store for, and you'll beat yourself in the head going, why did the grade not store for this? I can see a grade in the teacher grade book. I can see a grade in quick lookup. So let's talk about some of the catch-alls. What are things that you need to check afterwards to make sure, or even before you store, so that you know you will get a clean store? Kendall, if you'll go under system reports over there on reports, and scroll down up under all the help stuff to the membership and enrollment area. Okay, do y'all see that section enrollment audit and school enrollment audit? Okay, the section enrollment audit is huge. If you have students, and if you'll click on that, and I'm going to have a ton of errors on this because of the half data we have in this site. Scroll to the very bottom of this page, Kendall, because we got a ton of kids who we don't have in any schedules. Yeah, just grab to the bottom. Okay, these are what you're wanting to look for. So scroll up till we can get to this subset just above. There we go. Students with course date misalignments with school enrollments. If you are getting errors on kids, these errors will cause grades to not store on these students. If you see misalignments and section overlaps on kids, it will prevent their grades from storing. So my advice is before you try to run your stored grades process, go run this report and see if you have any errors. In fact, I recommend that people set a date on their calendar and you check this report and that school enrollment audit report once a month and keep these errors cleaned up, because they can cause domino effect errors across the page. Another thing, so let's say you clean these up, you went through storing, we have to be very careful, like Kendall said, about using that include only enrollment dates of a certain date so that you don't get those duplicated grades where a kid might have dropped and enrolled or things such as that. Even with that, still at times, depending on a kid's schedule, they can get a duplicated grade. There is a way to find those. If you will go down, Kendall, under system and to Power Tools. I believe it's under miscellaneous tools. Duplicate stored grades. And search for this year. Okay, so now sometimes duplicate grades are okay. Sometimes you might have a kid who, yes, took PE twice. Maybe you had to do something funny with their schedule and they had to take it twice in 1 year, so it's seeing it more than once and calling it to your attention. But sometimes it will be a kid who took multiple grades and it's like, hey, are you sure this kid should have gotten 2 of these grades? And if that's the case, you'll need to decide whether one of those grades need to be deleted or not. So this report right here can help you figure out if you have a kid who had a grade stored more than once. I'm trying to figure out. Click on Braxton Adams Q2 grade. So if you'll click on his name, let's look at his historical grades and see what happened. So, okay, so do you see how it did seem to store a null grade along with a proper grade because it has that double stack of that? You probably don't want those nulls. So, of course, if we had deleted the null grades, that wouldn't be an issue. But sometimes you'll actually capture where a grade is in there as well because it could have been where they were transferred out. And for some reason, that including statement, the dates of these enrollments just didn't line up with that. And so it captured both of them. And you would have to figure out which one is the correct grade that should be left. And you will manually just click in and delete. And so, like, if you were to just click on that null grade right there. Because if you didn't know, guys, you can manually delete a historical grade from this page right here by using that delete button and just confirm. So those are a couple of reports that I tell everybody to look at. One of them is kind of to preempt to get ready for storing, and then this one is to help do any cleanup on any duplicates that might have been stored inside of there. Casey said, can you show how to get back to that report? So if you'll go back to the main page, over on the left-hand side, under Setup, you go to System, and it's Power Tools. There's a lot of really neat reports in here if you've not poked around in Power Tools. And it's under Miscellaneous Tools. You can find Duplicate Stored Grades.
One other thing on my list, Stacy, was the special codes for exempt. So I can show that if you want. When you have an exam, if you do exam exemptions in your classes, your teachers have some options in their grade book to mark it exempt. Uh-oh, telling me that's not good. But you also, if you have a teacher mark it as exempt using the option I will show you first, then that will store as null. So if I go into my grade book, Power Teacher Pro, and a lot of times if we have a exam that we put in and our students are exempt, our teachers will go to grading and they'll go to all reporting terms and they'll just enter in that exam grade here by clicking in. And if they go to the bottom, they can mark exempt, and that marks the student was exempt. However, that would store as null. So what we would want to do then is have a special code. So you'll notice here I have codes that were set up alongside my grade scale. So if I go to the next student and I mark codes, it gives them the option to do exempt, and then that would not store as a null grade. And so that does need to be set up as a grade scale. So if you're going to have exam exemptions, that logged me out. If you're going to have exam exemptions when you go to store grades this semester at this point, then you're going to want to make sure that you have these special codes set up. So if I go to district office and I go to district setup, under grading, I'll have grade scales. And when I go into my grade scale, so I'm using this 100-point scale, but you'll notice it's also got a special code scale attached. So if I go in to edit this scale, this is my typical 100-point grade scale here. But for uses special codes, I have a special code scale that has been set up, and that will attach those options to this grade scale. So you have to create that special code scale. So if I go back, that's where you attach it. If I go back to my grade scales and I click into my special codes, that edit pencil, this is where I give my teachers those special code options. So I can have incomplete, failure, exempt, different things. And so if I have it marked as a final grade, then they can use that and mark the student as exempt. So whatever options your school or district gives to the teachers for marking final grades, if they can do failure to attendance, incomplete, exempt, if you want them to be able to mark those X1s as exempt and not store as a null, then you would want to create a grade scale like this with the special codes and attach it to your traditional grade scale as well.
And I'll say this because this right here always freaks people out. Y'all see that I had 100% as the percent for that? Did y'all catch that when she entered it in the teacher grade book? It's like it entered 100. I get a lot of emails that say, Stacy, teachers are seeing 100. Does that mean it's going to factor 100 in as them taking a final exam? It does not, because that checkbox that is beside that in that grade scale says it's an exempt grade. It doesn't matter what. You have to associate some numeric value right there. I just didn't feel right putting a 0 or anything else there. But because it's exempt, it just doesn't count it. Whatever weight you gave the exam, so like a million of us out there do the 40-40-20 split for like semesters and exams or quarters and exams. So if you do that, it's just going to take that 20% that should have been that grade that was right here, and it splits it back to the other two. So quarter 1 and 2 become a 50-50 split. It does exactly what we used to have to code iNow to do. This just does it automatically. So you don't pay any attention to that number that you see. It is there because you have to put some kind of number there to set this up. But as long as you make sure on your report card you're pulling the grade value and not the percentage. If you're pulling the percent, it's going to print 100 on there. But if you pull the grade value, it will just put that X or that E. If you know that you want to pull percent, then you might be in the situation where you tell your teachers don't use a code, just leave it blank. Just know that it's going to store a null code that you'll need to blow out later on. So those are your options. And somebody asked, is it okay for teachers just to do that direct override into X1 and not create an actual assignment for exams? Yes, in fact, that's a preferred method because it causes less issues. Because how many of y'all have issues when they go to put that assignment in and they use the wrong dates? So just to bypass all that, I've always instructed my teachers just to go straight to that all reporting terms page and just pop them in right there. It makes it so much easier. Oh, in case Casey just sent another one. If we don't have a special code set up, can we just leave the score blank, or will it factor as a 0? No, if you leave it blank, it divvies that percentage back up just as if you had exempted it. It just means, Casey, when they store, it's going to give that dash like Kendall showed earlier. That's a null grade.
I see a question earlier, I think we may have missed. The 7th grade takes civics in the first semester and geography in the second. Do we need to store those grades as final, or do we separate them like in a half credit classes? So correct me if I'm wrong, Stacy, but that would just be how they are scheduled. If those courses start and end in one semester, then the F1 would be the final grade because that course, that civics course, is finished at Christmas, say, and then the geography course counts or starts in January. So just how
Right.
they're scheduled.
Yep. And so, Myra, if you've got them across 2 different semesters, they're going to store 2 final grades. The civics and geography has been the hardest for us to wrap our head around because in I-Now we kind of shoved them all together, and you got that 1 yearly average for both classes. And so a lot of people wanted to go back to that. And technically, what I-Now did was wrong because those are 2 separate state course codes, and you can't get 1 yearly average for 2 courses. Each course should have had its own average. You couldn't do that in I-Now. I-Now had a flaw in that. This actually does it the correct way, where you should receive 2 different course grades because they are separate courses with separate standards.
Are you able to unmute Phyllis that she has a question
All
about?
right. So, yeah, let me hang on one second. Allow to unmute. Okay. All right, Phyllis, you should be able to unmute now.
Yes, thank you. I just didn't want to type all this in the chat. We just want to make sure that we are understanding correctly at our day program, STC. You know, they have students that are cross-enrolled, they're just remotely enrolled from us, but then they have students from the other districts that are cross-LEA enrolled. So
Yes.
I'm thinking that when our homeschools store grades, those kids at STC grades will get stored in that process. But for the kids that are cross LEA enrolled, I'm thinking that the day program will have to actually store those grades there.
That is correct.
Okay. I just want to make sure that we understood that. So
And
they will store, but only for those kids from Pelham and Alabaster.
yes, and something you might want to think about, Phyllis, to make it easier on you, instead of having your schools bring in those grades from day program in their stored grades process, just don't store the grades from other schools, and then just let the STC school just store for all the kids at one time. That way they don't have to do filtering on them. Well, and it'll move them everywhere.
I was thinking about that when we were watching this video, but then I was thinking about, you know, we have New Directions, we have Career Tech, we have several other places that also would not get stored if we did that.
I got you. Okay. Yeah, that would make sense because you would have to do that on others if you've got multiple ones.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you've got the best practice then.
Okay. Thank you.
And, you know, that's something else to keep in mind. You know, if you are a career tech center, because I think we ran into this a lot last year and people didn't realize it. If you're a career tech center in this district that accepts students from other districts, you've got to make sure that your career tech center is actually storing grades as well, or those grades won't go to the schools outside of your district that those kids come from. So I'll take I know from personal experience, let's take Randolph County and Roanoke City Schools. Randolph County has a career tech center that Roanoke City School students go to. If Randolph County's career tech center does not store grades, then Roanoke City Schools kids' grades will never make it back to Roanoke. If all they're doing is letting the high schools of Randolph County store and pull the grades in from the tech center, thinking that gets everybody, that excludes that one population of kids who don't go there. So make sure that if you're in that kind of situation, you are grabbing those and sending them out as well. It's going to be the same with STCs if you have some that are cross-enrolled. Any other questions that anyone has about it? You feel free to come off of mute. I've made it where everybody can unmute if you need to ask anything.
Stacey, I have a question not related to storing grades.
Okay.
When are you gonna, or have you considered starting scheduling stuff? Power scheduler, sorry.
Yes. We have a whole January filled out. Kendall just sent to me last week. And of course, it was going to go out in Monday's newsletter. That didn't happen when I came down with the flu. So I'm going to get that out to y'all. We have a whole slew of starting everything out. When we get back in January, that second week, I'm going to kick off with a webinar on like how to start up the new school year and what to get started to get active in Power Scheduler. And then we've got everything kind of starting lined out with that. So yes, lots coming up. Now we'll say I am still holding the webinar tomorrow that we're doing about certification. Highly suggest everybody, it will be recorded too if you can't make it, but if you can watch it, you need to watch it because there's some considerations people need to take as they're going into building their master schedule for next year, because there are schools getting a lot of hits for out of field for not doing scheduling correctly based on endorsements and everything else and instructional delivery type. So we're going to clear all that up tomorrow to prep into scheduling for next year.
Okay, perfect. I just know that some of our schools wanted to get started a little earlier than we did last year. So,
oh yeah, there's one school in the district that y'all did all of their student requests over fall break, like are almost finished with scheduling, and I'm so envious of them. I'm like, that's kind of smart. They're like, counselors are slow during that time, so we went ahead and just did it now, and we wait to see who fails first semester, and we'll just readjust those on the fly during the beginning of second semester like they normally do. I'm like, hey. So yeah, a lot of people have gone ahead and started up their next school year. I will say this, you really only need to start working on it if you are going to be in Power Scheduler. If you are an elementary school that does everything on the live side, I really would not start working on scheduling until you have a board approved calendar for next year, because if you start working with scheduling on the live side and you end up having to change those dates of your years and terms, it will cause a domino effect of changes you have to make that can really mess some stuff up. So if you are Power Scheduling, you have plenty of time for those changes to occur if you don't have a board approved calendar, because you're not committing yet. You can work in Power Schedule forever, so we can go ahead and do those. Phyllis, you can actually already start seeing some. If you go to the courses app and search for courses that start in 2023, courses.alsde.edu, we'll have Kendall go through it. You can go ahead and start seeing what the new courses are. I am going to try to work with Sean to see if I can get, you know how we used to get that old list of like what was being updated, what's being retired, and what the new ones are, just the short little 2-pagers we used to get. I'm going to see if I can get those so I don't have to dig through this whole thing. But filter by begin year 2023, Kendall. So you can already see some of your new course numbers. And then if you want to see what's ending in 2023, you can filter by in year 2022, 2023. I'm trying to remember which way you'd have to go with it. 22. Okay, so he hasn't end dated any yet, but we know what new ones are going to be available. So if you're looking for those. Yep. And I mean, worst case scenario, if you use the old course numbers for them to schedule and then something changes, you can actually change them in mass over in Power Scheduler, and it's pretty easy too. Whitney's asking, does Power Scheduler have to be active for next year for them to utilize teacher recommendations? I do believe so, Whitney. So you just need to turn it on, get your scenario going and all, and then they can go in through the recommendations. Anything else from anyone? All right, well, I'm going to stop the recording, let it render. I will email this out to everyone.